Hello everyone, Sam here, and we gotta talk about the Devil Doctor. I started reading this story from Project Gutenberg initially, but then halfway through I got the Fu Manchu Omnibus, Volume 1. I actually have the rest of the volumes behind me somewhere. But this is where I read half of it from. As most of you would expect, The Devil Doctor was written by Sax Rohmer and was originally published in the United Kingdom in 1916. It was later released in the United States under the title The Return of Dr. Fu Manchu. The last Fu Manchu story I talked about, I mentioned that I thought the American title for the first Dr. Fu Manchu story was better. I think it was called The Insidious Dr. Fu Manchu. But this is a case where I actually like the UK title better. The US title, The Return of Dr. Fu Manchu, is a little, just kind of flat. It's like, oh yeah, he's returning. But The Devil Doctor, that has a lot more kick to it in my mind. So I actually like the UK title better this time around. So I want to talk a little bit about where Sax Rohmer was after the first Fu Manchu collection. I say it's a collection. It's often framed as a novel, but it kind of is a story collection. So we'll say the first Fu Manchu story. But after that first collection came out, Rohmer was a success. He'd found that big success he was looking for, and he started working on a couple of other projects that he released between that first Fu Manchu collection and The Devil Doctor. Some of these are, I have them written down here, The Sins of Severak Babylon. Can't find a whole lot of information about that one, but from what I hear, it was another serial that he wrote that dealt with sort of a modern-day Robin Hood type character. I'll be interested to read that sometime because I just have heard very few people talk about it, so that would be kind of interesting to look at. He also did another one of his famous stories. I say stories, but it was The Romance of Sorcery, which was not a fiction collection, but a non-fiction account of Rohmer's studies of ancient sorcery and the occult. It was apparently pretty well known at the time and is probably Rohmer's most famous non-fictional work. And some people have argued that he used a lot of inspiration from his studies on ancient sorcery and the occult for his later stories, both Fu Manchu and non-Fu Manchu stories. So I'll definitely want to read that at some point because that's a pretty interesting story focus. Study focus. But yeah, so I'll check that out sometime. And another story he released during this period was The Yellow Claw. And it was a mystery story that featured Gaston Max, who was another one of Rohmer's other series characters. A lot of people think that Rohmer only wrote Fu Manchu, but he did write several other characters, and Gaston Max was one of them. And Gaston Max, apparently his deal was that he was a Paris detective who was like a master of disguise, and in The Yellow Claw, apparently he's trying to search for an opium kingpin and bring him to justice. So, a surprising amount of variety for Rohmer, considering that the first Fu Manchu story was released, let me make sure I'm getting this right, it was released in 1913, yeah. So, between 1913 and 1916, he was doing these three other fairly big projects. But he returned to Fu Manchu because he'd kind of be a fool not to. He was a huge success. So a sequel seemed only natural. And just like the first story, it actually began as a series of stories that was a serial. And this time, not the storyteller like the first batch were, but Collier's. And Collier's, for those who don't know, was a huge magazine. I haven't paid enough attention to modern magazines to know if it's still around, but it was around for a long time, and it was huge. It was one of the best and most famous slick magazines. Not a pulp magazine. The pulp magazines were a lower tier in the eyes of the public at the time. Slicks were like the high-end stuff. It was the stuff you really wanted to get into. And this batch of stories was published. The first one was published on November 21st, 1914, and it ran intermittently throughout 1915. The last one was published in December 4th, 1915. So, much like the first one, it was more a series of short stories that sort of combined into this longer arc. So it wasn't really a proper novel. It was more of a serial that had individual chapters. So, essentially, he's doing the same thing with the Devil Doctor. And yeah, that was where Rohmer was at in his career by this point. So, he'd had some success, and yeah, it just made sense to keep continuing that success. So what is the actual setup for the story? Well, slight spoiler for the the end of the first story, but supposedly Fu Manchu was defeated. There was a big fire in a cottage. He seemingly burned up in the ashes. But again, this is but Rohmer was smart enough to include an out because Fu Manchu's crafty, so there was a possibility he might have escaped at the end. And this story confirms it. Yeah, he escaped. And the Devil Doctor starts 2 years after the previous book's finale. And Dr. Petrie is back to his medical practice. And he's kind of down the dumps because Karamana, the slave girl who helped him and Nayland Smith in the first book, she just kind of disappeared after she left for Egypt, even when Dr. Petrie went to look for her. So he just returned to his London medical practice, and things are going okay, but he's kind of down the dumps because he couldn't find her. But just like the first time, Nayland Smith bursts in and says, Fu Manchu is alive. And when Smith was back in Burma, he found evidence that Fu Manchu was alive and Manchu had come back to London. So this starts the next round of shenanigans where they start pursuing Fu Manchu, not just in London, but across England. And several times the chase reverses to where Fu Manchu is after them. So these series of stories combine to show how Smith and Petrie fight Fu Manchu and try to stop him once and for all. So, an interesting setup. And it's kind of interesting that the story kind of runs on real time, because when Rohmer first started publishing the first batch of stories, he started publishing them in 1912. But by the time of he started publishing in the Collier's this round of stories for the Devil Doctor, it was 1914. So he actually is kind of running a little bit on real time. So that's kind of interesting that he was actually sort of keeping real time at this point in the story. And others have told me that Rohmer kind of kept this real time element through later versions of the story. Well, not later version of the story, later stories in the Fu Manchu saga. So that's kind of interesting. So I want to talk about what works and what doesn't in the story. I'm actually going to start with what I think doesn't quite work in the story. Because there are a few things that I don't think entirely work here. This one is probably the most obvious one. These were all sort of separate stories, and because of that, there are stories that work better than other stories do. Because one of the early... Because there are a lot of good individual moments in this story, and when you look at them as individual stories, there are a lot of good ones in here. But then you have some that are just much stronger than others. One early tale, I can't remember if it was the first or second one. It has a reveal that the murder weapon that Fu Manchu was using was a cat that its claws were laced with poison. And, you know, it went up and scratched somebody and they dropped dead. And that was one I was kind of like, okay, that's a little goofy there. I'm like, that was the one that was probably the one that I was like, okay, that doesn't quite work for me. But yeah, so you get occasional stories like that. There are not god-awful, but there's definitely ones that are stronger than others. So that's kind of a natural problem of doing a story that's more of a more separate stories combined. You kind of get that thing where one's written with a much stronger conceit than the others. So that was a problem I had with the first one. It's a problem I have with this one too. So it's not a unique problem at this point in the Fu Manchu series, but I would argue it is a problem. This second problem is probably the biggest problem I had with the story, which is Karamana. Karamana was one of the best characters in the first story, in my opinion, because she actually had sort of an interesting intrigue to her, where you're trying to figure out, well, why is she going behind Fu Manchu's back to help Nayland and Petrie? And she had this very good character arc where she learns slowly to trust Dr. Petrie and finally save the person she was trying to save. But here, Karamana undergoes a bit of a character regression because she returns to Dr. Fu Manchu's service. Even though the whole point of the first story was she was trying to get out of it. And the thing is, there is an explanation for why she does this. I'm trying not to spoil it, but it's an explanation that makes sense within the world of the story. But because Rohmer kind of returns her to that position of her character that she was in the first one, it means that she doesn't get a whole lot to do until the second half of this collection, because she's so again, I'm trying not to spoil it, but there is a reason she is back to being devoted to the Doctor, and it makes sense, but only towards the second half does it kind of start wearing off, and she kind of gets back to that the driven person she was in the first novel. And the also the explanation, while the explanation itself makes sense for why she's back with Fu Manchu, there are some things that feel like Rohmer's kind of cheating with this, because essentially the thing that's keeping her in Fu Manchu's service has a weakness. If this one thing is done, she will leave his service. And the problem is this thing happens twice to her during this story. The first time it doesn't really work, but the second time it does. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense of why the first time it didn't work. Again, I'm trying to be vague so I don't spoil it, but it does happen to her one time and it doesn't work, second time it doesn't. And Rohmer's kind of shaky about why it worked the second time. So, yeah, that part I didn't like, because Karamana was one of the more interesting characters of the first, and this time around it kind of feels like she's pigeonholed back into the role of Fu Manchu's servant, because Rohmer wanted to replicate that dynamic from the first book, but in order to do it, he kind of had to, twist a few rules. And yeah, the explanation for it is fine within the story itself, but it doesn't change the fact that it kind of forces Karamana to not really do much until the second half of the collection. So that was probably my biggest complaint with the story. The other big problem I have with the story is that this story has a brilliant climax. I'll tell you about it in a minute, but there's a great climax to the story where, it leaves it open for a sequel. Fu Manchu has a great defeat. And you think, oh, well, that's a great place to leave off. That's a great climax. But just like the last story, there's this final story that's kind of the final thing that happens, where all the characters are on a boat and then they start getting attacked by a mummy. Ironically, I was reading this during my Mummy May reading event, so that's kind of a interesting coincidence. But this whole final thing with the mummy on the cruise ship, it's not bad as an individual like horror mystery, but it can't live up to that final climax against Fu Manchu. So it makes the whole story kind of feel anticlimactic, and that ending part just kind of feels tacked on. I've heard some people justify it as, oh no, you need that final scene because it shows that even though the Doctor is seemingly defeated, he still has his acolytes ready to strike. And I'm kind of like, that seems, I understand that logic, but I just don't think it entirely meshes here. Especially when you have such a strong climax. It's like, it's padding things out. That's what it feels like. So, yeah, not a huge fan of that mummy story on the cruise ship in regards to the wider surrounding stories. If it was by itself, I'd probably be fine, but when you shove it into a full story collection and it's supposed to be the ending of your story, yeah, it doesn't really work for me in that respect. So that is what I didn't care for in the story. But I will talk about what I did like in the story. Unfortunately, there's a lot I really enjoyed about this Devil Doctor. The first is the most obvious. It's still very fast-paced. I said in my review for the first Fu Manchu story that if the stories had been like really drawn out and sluggish, I probably would have been more upset with the disjointed nature of the tales. But because they're very fast-paced and exciting, that means that you don't really get too bored. Rohmer keeps the motion going. He makes sure that we don't dwell too long on things. And because it's constantly in motion, you never get bored. Which boredom, a lot of people don't really think of books. Oh, a slow read. That we think of like, oh, a slow read allows you to absorb atmosphere, but when it comes to like adventure and mystery writing, sometimes a faster pace can work a lot better than like a slow and ponderous pace. I think it works really well here. I also like that the story has a much stronger sense of continuity than the first story did, because there are characters from the first Fu Manchu book that show up back here again, like Reverend Eltham and Sir Lionel Barton. And they're involved in these little adventures with Petrie and Smith. And even after their role in the story is done and they've moved on, there are actually... Petrie will actually mention them in the later sections, saying, oh, well, here's how Reverend Eltham is doing, here's how Sir Barton is doing. So it definitely feels a lot more cohesive. Like, these do not feel... They are still disjointed stories combined into one, but they feel a lot more cohesive. So I like that there's a stronger continuity here. I also really enjoyed the sense of world building to this story, because we get like these mentions of things in the past. We get this sense of, oh yeah, things are going on in this world that we have not seen, but they are going on. And the first book kind of had this in certain parts, but I definitely, again, I think it's much more present here. My favorite is this one moment where Fu Manchu has a katana. And he mentions he has the katana because he came into conflict with some Japanese noble house within the recent past. And again, you're kind of wondering, well, what was going on there? Why was he fighting this noble Japanese house? But again, that just serves the world building. That lets you know, okay, things are going on around the world that we don't know about, but they are happening. So that's very cool. I mentioned the stories are still kind of disjointed, but I do think that compared to the first book, this second book connects the individual stories much better. Because for one instance, there's this story called the Coughing Horror, and it involves Petrie and Smith sort of chasing this weird coughing horror that's like reaching into windows and strangling people. And there's this brief subplot where Petrie sees in a bookshop with like Asian artifacts, Asian books, and then the following story, titled The Silver Buddha, he goes back to that bookshop, and that becomes the focal point of the adventure. So there's a lot better connection here, where it kind of feels like this element is set up, and then Rohmer pays off on that element later. So I really like that the stories don't feel as disconnected this time around. They do feel like A is connected to B is connected to C. So I really enjoyed that element. We also get kind of an interesting expansion on Fu Manchu's weird morality, or lack thereof. And we learn more about his twisted sense of honor. Because in the first story, he captures a guy and tortures him for information, but he ends up sparing that torture victim because he has a great dignity to he is deeply impressed by the torture victim's refusal to give up his friend. So he decides to let him go, but also comes with the caveat that Fu Manchu lets him go because the torture victim didn't see Fu Manchu's face, so he can't identify him. So again, Fu Manchu has a sense of honor, but he has pragmatic reasons for why he's willing to do some of these things. So his morality is twisted, but he does have a certain amount of it. I also really like... I vaguely remember this being somewhat present in the first book, but the second book really emphasizes this, that Fu Manchu actually has a great deal of respect for Dr. Petrie. He hates Nayland Smith. He's like, no, he straight up says, no, I don't like Smith. But he actually really respects Dr. Petrie. But it's kind of amusing because he kind of respects Dr. Petrie because he assumes that Petrie is actually this brilliant doctor because Nayland Smith chose him to come chase me, so he must be a supreme genius or a great mastermind of a doctor. But he's not. Dr. Petrie is just a regular physician who has a general practice. So there's kind of a interesting idea there where Fu Manchu is like, oh, Dr. Petrie, you're a wonderful addition. I hope you'll come and join my quest for conquest. But it's kind of based on a faulty premise. So there's a couple things like here where you sort of see Fu Manchu is not as infallible as he presents himself. Which is kind of an interesting portrayal. This is also the story that reveals that Fu Manchu is most likely not his real name. There's a strong implication here that Fu Manchu is actually an assumed name, and that he actually had a different name several years ago. So that's kind of an interesting thing. The idea that Fu Manchu is a title or an alias. It's not his real name. I found that kind of interesting. The story introduces the idea of the Seven Group. I don't know if this becomes the C-Fan syndicate later on, but the Seven Group is introduced, and it's sort of stated that Fu Manchu is one of the head honchos, but he's not the head honcho. He's one of the major criminals of the Seven, but he's not necessarily the main boss yet. And that's kind of an interesting thing in this book, because in the first book, it was kind of portrayed like, Fu Manchu is supreme. But this one kind of points out, well, no, he's not quite as supreme and all-powerful as he portrays himself or how he becomes later. Because he's actually kind of fragile in this story, where at one point he joins this Chinese secret society involving a white peacock, and he actually gets in trouble with the leader of this Chinese white peacock society, and he actually needs Dr. Petrie's help in order to escape being punished by the white peacock. I won't say why, but it's kind of interesting that Fu Manchu is actually kind of more vulnerable here, and he's not the head honcho or the big guy like he might have been in the first one. This one kind of emphasizes, well, no, Fu Manchu, you're part of a cog, and there are people above you who can bring the hammer down. So that's kind of an interesting element. And there's also times where Fu Manchu just gets manhandled in this story a lot. Like that aura of invincibility he had in the first story No, I think at one point Dr. Petrie like hits him in the face. Uh, Slight spoiler: he also gets shot at one point, so it's kind of like, yeah, Fu Manchu is actually much more vulnerable this time around, and that could backfire. Like for some people, I could see some people going, well, that kind of ruins his sense of aura and uh, invincibility. But I actually kind of like it because it sort of emphasizes that, yeah, Fu Manchu is not, he's a genius, but he's not a god, as much as he might proclaim himself to be. This story kind of knocks him down a peg and says, well, you're a clever man, Fu Manchu, but you're not infallible. So I actually kind of enjoy that. And plus, the moments where Fu Manchu does get humbled, it's not necessarily done just because Rohmer is feeling spiteful. It's there to show our heroes and main characters slowly growing more sure of themselves and being able to fight back against Fu Manchu in ways that he simply couldn't expect. So I think it works here. This slightly more fallible Fu Manchu. Uh, I mentioned Smith and Dr. Petrie here a bit. Uh, while I said I didn't like that Karamana didn't really have much to do until the second half of the novel, I do like that the first half of the novel actually has Smith and Dr. Petrie have to step up to save themselves multiple times. Uh, because in the first novel, a lot of their escapes were facilitated by Karamana, but this one, that first half, Karamana's not helping them out, so they actually have to pull their stuff together and fight their way out of Fu Manchu's machinations. So I kind of like that they were kind of becoming a little more self-sufficient and being able to get out of their jams. At least in that first half. The second half, Karamana starts really helping them out again, but that first half, this does show them becoming a little more able as fighters and counter forces against Fu Manchu. I also really like how this story actually gives a solid conflict between Nayland Smith and Dr. Petrie. Because in the first book, Smith is... I said in his first... I like this in the first book, but Smith was a bit of a jackass in that. He was a real stubborn... He wouldn't tell Petrie anything. He was a jerk. And this story actually acknowledges the fact that Nayland Smith is a jerk and would push Dr. Petrie's buttons. And Dr. Petrie pushes Smith's buttons because Petrie goes off on certain hunts and certain whims that Smith gets mad about. But in that first story, they were kind of breezed over. Those character differences weren't really examined. This one makes it a big deal because there are times where Petrie and Smith just get really mad at each other. And I think there was one where, Smith calls Petrie stupid and naive, which isn't entirely wrong, but then Petrie gets mad because Smith keeps withholding things from him that he should just tell Petrie. He has time. They're not in a rush. One big thing is that Smith withholds a lot of information about Karamana because he knows something about Karamana's situation that Petrie doesn't. But Smith doesn't bother telling him this till like halfway into the story. And Petrie gets so mad he goes off on his own investigation without telling Smith, and that almost ends in disaster. It's a thing where you want to say, okay, Petrie, you were being stupid, but it's also you 100% understand why he's like, oh, you're not going to tell me about Karamana, Smith? Well, I'm going to go do something else and not tell you about it. And it's like, it's petty and not the smartest thing, but you 100% understand his frustration and why he would do that. So I like that we have that tension between Smith and Petrie. And speaking of Petrie, I just like that Dr. Petrie is much more heroic this time around. Because he actually has moments where he has to step up and save himself because Smith isn't around. And he does have a couple of good moments in here where he has to figure out how to get out of these situations. So I really like that Dr. Petrie is actually kind of maturing as a character and becoming more heroic. I also really like how often this story has a lot of dips into horror. I was aware that Rohmer really liked dipping into sort of horror and occult scenarios, but this one has a lot of great horror moments. One is called Cragmire Tower, and that's when Smith and Petrie go to find a scholar who's living in a haunted estate with this big tower, and it like has this gothic and sordid history, and it very much plays as sort of a haunted house tale. And there's another one that shows it's called The Fiery Hand, and it deals with this phantasm that's terrorizing the inhabitants of this cottage. So Rohmer really dips a lot into horror here. He kind of did this in the first one, but it's a lot more explicit this time around, and it's very good because that kind of fits with the whole idea of a sinister supervillain and going into these very creepy environments. So I really like that element. I mentioned this earlier, but this story has a fantastic finale. Because it's a thing where Fu Manchu sets up this really sadistic situation where he sticks Smith in a bunch of cages, and the cages are like over each section of Smith's body, going from his feet to his head. And he's going to release rats into each of the cage, and he's going to pull up the cages one by one by one until these rats, which are hungry and fighting, eating and scratching Smith all the way up to his head. And there's only one way out, which Fu Manchu has set up, where Dr. Petrie can provide a mercy kill to Smith by chopping off his head with a samurai sword. So it's an extremely sadistic moment for Fu Manchu, but it has a good ending, and it's I definitely like this one more than the finale for the first book. Because, again, the first book, it kind of had this, it had a strong finale, but kind of like this book, too, it kind of had an epilogue that sort of dragged things out. But I actually, if I had to compare the two finales, I like the Devil Doctors more, just because it's very inventive for the bizarre torture Fu Manchu makes for Smith. And I also like... This is a spoiler, but not really. Fu Manchu seemingly comes to his end here with a pretty brutal end involving getting blown away with a certain firearm. Now, I'm willing to spoil that because... it's an ending to the character, but there's a dozen more stories. He's not gonna be ended that easily. I'm kind of I kind of want to start reading the next book soon because I kind of want to see, okay, Romer, how are you going to uh, how are you going to explain him escaping that? Because he gets shot in a area of the body where it is very hard to fake being shot. I'll leave it at that. But yeah, I like that Romer kind of creates this aura of mystery around Fu Manchu, and for this finale, he just goes, "Oh, there's a very easy solution." Uh, so that's kind of an interesting conclusion to the character for this story. So yeah, that was a lot of fun. So the final ranking for the Devil Doctor. I rank on the 5-star system, 0 out of 5 being the worst, 5 out of 5 being the best. And I would say the Devil Doctor is a solid 4 out of 5 stars, which in my mind is a good book. Like I said, my biggest issues with it are some of these tales are a little clunky. I didn't care for them. And I really don't like Karamana's character regression in the first half of the story. Like I said, there is an explanation for it and it does make sense. But I just don't like that Romer couldn't think of a more creative way to have her in the story that wasn't just repeating her, oh, she's a servant of Fu Manchu situation. So, yeah, that part, I would say that part kind of drags it down a little from a 5 out of 5 to a 4 out of 5 in my mind. But I would say on the whole, I had a way more positive experience with this than negative, because the story really does improve on the first one. It kind of takes all the elements of the first one that maybe weren't as developed or weren't even mentioned, and it kind of expands on them and adds these new ideas. And I think that's what a good sequel should do, take the blueprint of the first and build up upon it. So yeah, I really liked that element, and I just kind of like how it expands the character dynamics. We get to see how Fu Manchu feels about Dr. Petrie. We get to see how Smith and Petrie feel about each other. So it just sort of, it does what a sequel should do. It expands on everything that came before. So yeah, I think it really works in that respect. I would definitely recommend this story for any Fu Manchu fans, because this really shows Romer improving not just his writing and plotting, but Fu Manchu as a character and his the auxiliary characters around him. So definitely would recommend this one. Any inspiration? For those that don't know, I'm a working writer, and I like talking about, after I finish discussing these stories, about whether they've inspired me in any way. And this story has inspired me, and ironically, it's one of the parts that I didn't much care for. It's that final epilogue scene about the mummy on the cruise ship that Petrie and Smith and Karamana are on. Because I really like the idea of a mummy that's like stuck on a cruise ship. You know, there's sort of an interesting horror element you could do there. I could definitely see that working as a self-contained horror story. Because there have been plenty of horror stories and movies about like haunted cruise ships or a monster on a cruise ship. So yeah, I kind of like the idea of like doing a mummy on a cruise ship is a pretty cool idea. So maybe something will come of that. Well, that's all I have to say about the Devil Doctor, so I guess I'll close things off here. Like I said, I really recommend you check it out if you're into Fu Manchu stories. And I will say that I think it probably works better if you've read the first one. Not so much for continuity, but because you really do see how much Rohmer improves on the second outing. That's one of the main reasons I like it, because it really does feel like a natural expansion of the Fu Manchu mythos. So I would say read the first one before this if you haven't, just because you'll really notice the improvement in Rohmer's writing. So yeah, check it out. And yeah, I will get back to you guys on the third Fu Manchu story soon. What's it called? The Sifan Mysteries. That's the British title. I'm sure it has a different American title, but we'll get to that one sometime in the near future. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you guys later. Bye.